Have you ever felt that something's amiss in our world? That a hidden force is at play behind the scenes? In a time when trust in our political leaders is at an all-time low, our intuition is telling us there is something wrong in our reality. Yet we cannot pinpoint exactly what is wrong. As the great Manly P. Hall once said, "It's not the wrath of the Almighty, but the stupidity of man that is causing most of the trouble." This podcast is not about personal gain or fortune. I'm here because I recognize that in the crisis of overwhelming ignorance and deception in which we live, I have a moral obligation to communicate what I know to be taking place in our world in order for something to be done about it. Welcome to the Free Your Mind Canada podcast, where we dive into deep state politics, philosophy, the occult, spirituality, and above all else, natural law. This podcast is all about human freedom, and I'm your host, Adrian Cleveland, inviting you to join me on this enlightening journey.
I'll never surrender. I'll never surrender.
So welcome to episode 2. It's on corporations. So last episode we talked about government and how corporate power runs the majority of government policy. So let's look at this institution. Like everything, has an ostensible purpose versus a true purpose. So once again, let's go over ostensible. Represented or appearing as such, not actually being what appearance indicates. Suggesting an appearance to unabated senses, not borne out by rigorous examination or greater knowledge, based on deceptive resemblance or faulty observation, or influenced by emotions that prevent a clear view, or in other words, illusory. So what are the ostensible purpose of corporations? So we're told that they're there to create products that consumers want or need, to generate wealth and prosperity, to create jobs, to compete among other businesses, or in other words, competition, to be part of the economy, and to create technological advancement. So what really is a corporation? Where did it get its origins? So a corporation was originally an association of persons getting together to achieve a common cause for the public good. In other words, an organization. They were state charters, which is an entity established by the state power. And there was clear stipulations in their state-issued charters on things such as how long they could operate, amount of capitalization, what they made, did, or maintained, and the people a part of the corporation, the shareholders, were held liable. The corporation was a subordinate entity to the public. In other words, a corporation was, hey, we're in the community, we want to build a bridge, a bunch of people get together, incorporate, and build a bridge, something along those lines. And what that organization did specifically was specifically stated in what the state charter mandated it to do. So after that point, courts gradually extended the rights and privileges of corporations. Under the 14th Amendment of the United States Constitution, corporations were considered people. So this was an amendment, the 14th Amendment of the United States, meant to help newly freed slaves, but out of the 307 cases constituting the 14th Amendment, 288 were done by corporations and only 19 by African Americans. So now with these corporations as people, they now have rights as flesh and blood individuals. And then they were called limited liability corporations, or you might know them as LLCs. So they can buy, sell, hold property, take out loans, can sue and be sued, and they no longer have a fixed purpose. So you used to keep the individual liable for their actions, but now where we've made corporations this legal entity, an individual under the law, it becomes its own person per se. And it's the same here in Canada. It's in our laws as well. A corporation has the capacity and subject to the act, the rights, powers, and privileges of a natural person. So me and you know through common sense that a corporation does not equal a person. So this idea that corporations being a person was actually something opposed by conservatives in the day as a return to a feudalist structure and a form of communism, or what's known as collectivism, and an attack on classical liberalism, that type of philosophy where rights and liberties are with the individual rather than this weird entity that's not a person at all. Courts made law that corporations' responsibility is to increase profit for shareholders and externalizes moral responsibility. And so that's an issue there where, as a person, you and I as a person, we have feelings, we have emotions, we can determine how we treat and what we do to others, versus a corporation we're calling as a person, but its only and main goal is to produce profit for shareholders. So if corporations are citizens of the world, what type of citizen would they be? And psychologically, that would be considered a psychopath because it's a person, but it's an amoral person. So corporations being amoral people, what does that tend to lead to? It leads to a multitude of things, but for example, low wages and working conditions for labor, destruction of the environment, turning people into mindless consumers through propaganda, or what they now call marketing. And there was actually a study done where they tested how many times children nag their parents for a certain toy that they saw in an advertisement. And based on the number of times the children nag their parents, they were able to figure out how frequently that toy would sell. So it's not about creating a product or service that somebody actually wants. It's about manipulating them into buying something that they don't really need. Other aspects is using the patent system to patent microorganisms. So any new forms of life found on this planet can be patented by a corporation. Collusion with Nazis. A lot of people don't know this, but there was many Western corporations that actually did business with the Nazis. The other aspect is war. So the control of energy resources around the world, oil, the military-industrial complex. Corporations also control the media that we consume on a daily basis. They make political contributions through lobbying, and a case in the United States called Citizens United, where corporations are considered people. They can essentially give as much money as they want to a politician because they're considered a person. So it doesn't matter if they give them $5 or $6 trillion, they're allowed to do that under the law. So you can figure if you have a ton of money and you're pushing that towards some politician's political campaign, what kind of influence that has on policymaking. Corporations also control food supply through seed and agriculture. Main one there, Monsanto, now merged as Monsanto Bayer, and they hold the majority of the seed in all your agriculture that you eat. And another aspect of corporations is their infinite profit growth is unsustainable. In other words, they want more and more and more and more and more profit, which means they have to create more and more and more and more resources, but resources aren't infinite. So this notion that you can create more profit for yourself as selling more and more stuff is just not possible. And good documentary to watch on this topic on how corporations are pretty much destroying our world. You can watch the documentary called The Corporation, based on the book that it was written about. So let's look at the structure of corporations. Corporations really are private tyrannies themselves. So they have a top-down command structure. So you get to insert yourself somewhere in this command structure called getting a job. And if you're propagandized enough into the institution, then you get to move up the ladder, maybe make a little bit more. Corporations are unaccountable to the public. They are secret institutions. They hold enormous power, and they work for profit of shareholders. That's why I consider them a private tyranny. You don't know what they're doing. Top-down command. You insert yourself somewhere in that system, and somebody above you is dictating what you do. So that's not just a private tyranny, that's a form of feudalism. So pursuit of profit for shareholders means low wages for the working class. So it was Plato that said the difference in pay from the lowest earner to the highest earner should be 6-1. J.P. Morgan, banker J.P. Morgan, said it should be 20-1. Now, I'm not for a full equal distribution of resources, because that would not incentivize people from taking on more complex tasks. And like I said, JP Morgan said 20-1, but today a CEO's pay compared to its workers is 500-1. Not 6-1, not 20-1, 500-1. The chart on the right of the presentation, this was a book called, it's a Canadian publication by William Carroll. It's called Organizing the 1%. So he has in this figure here, average minimum wage of full-time earners, $23,000. Average wage and salary of full year earnings, $49,000, nearly $50,000. And then the average top 100 CEOs, nearly $10 million. So yeah, you look at and that's just one C-suite employee. Usually there's 3 to 5 of them on a board, and that doesn't even count for the shareholders that they're accounting to. And you can't tell me, yeah, you may be top of your game, but you can't tell me you produce that much more for an organization compared to the working class that are building the products and services. So let's look at mergers and acquisitions of corporations. So part of mergers and acquisitions, there's 2 kinds of integration, horizontal integration and vertical integration. Horizontal integration is consolidation of industry, i.e. a larger firm buying up its smaller competitors. So you're probably familiar with that. It's, hey, these companies were in competition before. One of them bought them out. Vertical integration is linking elements of production with distribution into a single operating structure, i.e., you might have a car manufacturer may acquire a parts manufacturer, or another good example of this is a company called Luxottica controlling sunglasses. So they own Sunglass Hut, they own Vogue Optical, they own the different products in Sunglass Hut. So they own Oakley, they own Ray-Ban, they own Persol, they own the mall, and they also own the warehouse that these sunglasses are made. Sometimes they're even made in the same warehouse. So this means one company controls some or all steps of production, which leaves them with, for example, Luxottica, they have a monopoly on the market. It appears that you're buying a different brand, but it's really the same thing. So we sold out Canada. So all the corporations, independent Canadian corporations that we had, have been sold out to large international industrialists, either Americans or corporations overseas. So, for example, Labatt sold to Interbrew. Molson sold to Coors. Sleeman sold to Sapporo. Tim Hortons sold to Wendy's. The Canadian National Railway sold and owned by Americans now. Highway 407, the ETR, sold to Sintra and Macquarie, I think the name is. Steel Co., steel manufacturer here in Canada, sold to US Steel. DeFacy, another Canadian manufacturer, I think, of steel, sold to Arcelor. Macmillan Boladell sold to a engineered wood manufacturer in the States. So Macmillan used to be a massive BC Forestry Products company. And so we're talking about selling off the wood that we use to build our homes. CP Ships sold to Hapag Lloyd. Alcan, which was an aluminum manufacturer, sold to Rio Tinto. And the list really goes on and on and on and on and on and on and on. So all these Canadian-owned started and owned Canadian-owned corporations that we used to have here supplying good jobs to Canadians have been sold out to massive corporations, which you can't imagine what happens there. They take their labor and they say, hey, we're going to close up shop in Canada and we're going to go for cheap labor in somewhere like China. And if you're wondering why our economy is a mess, like I said, we sold everything we have. And you can thank our politicians for letting that happen. Let's talk about interlocking directorates. So corporations usually have a board of directors. And so there's something called a direct interlock and an indirect interlock. A direct interlock means directors sitting on more than one board. So you might have a board member on a board of directors of one corporation, but that member also sits on board of directors of another corporation. An indirect interlock is when directors from different boards sit together on a third board. So you might have board member A, a part of board of corporation A, and then you may have board member B sitting on board of corporation B, and then board member A and B sitting on the board of corporation C. In other words, they're buddies on another corporation. So this creates interlocking directorates and linkages or cohesion between corporations. And so, in other words, we start losing out on having competition in a free market. Instead, the market becomes a network of command economies. And a study done by William Carroll in Canada, there are fewer than 500 individuals who sit on the boards of the top 250 corporations in Canada. So we're talking about 500 people operating the top 250 corporations in Canada. And that creates a wealth gap that's even bigger than what we see in the United States. And it's estimated those 250 corporations, they employ 1 million Canadians, not to mention the spin-off of that, of the subsequent jobs from those 1 million Canadians being employed. So really, we're talking about 500 people that can really run and control economic life here in Canada. If they all decide to jump ship and close down these businesses and ship them off to China or overseas, you could really start a recession in Canada just based on those 500 people. So here's a figure example, once again, the book Organizing the 1%. TransCanada's board interlocks. So we have a corporation called TransCanada. Its members on a part of that board, and how those members are board members of other corporations in Canada. Major corporations. Another figure, Power Corporation of Canada organizational chart. If you don't know anything about Power Corp, this is a holding company here in Canada owned by the Desmarais family, and their hands are in everything. So if you look at this chart, all the different financial institutions in Canada, and their hands are in your politicians as well, regardless of what side of the aisle they're on, conservative or liberal. And I'll talk about the politician side of it in a later episode. Another one, interlocks among 7 large Canadian financial institutions and other large corporations. So we got interlocks between things like Power Corp, RBC, Scotiabank, and here they are on the boards of major corporations like Enbridge, Air Canada, CGI, TransCanada, a bunch of them. So these, even the banks are involved with the corporations that they're supposedly giving loans and money to. Cross ownership among the largest Canadian banks and financial institutions. So we have, this illustrates a network of intercorporate ownership among the 5 biggest Canadian banks plus Power Corporation. So we got Royal Bank, TD Bank, Scotiabank, Bank of Montreal, CIBC, and we think all these different big charter banks in Canada are competitors of one another, yet there they are, all owned and interlocked by the same board of directors. So they're not really competing with each other whatsoever. It's all owned by the same people. So let's talk about neoliberalism, and so, which is a stark contrast to classical liberalism economics. So it is a program of economic and public policy restructuring. It was imposed during the Reagan-Thatcher era, and it makes claim of of free markets through deregulating government, more privatization, and less government. Instead, they are protectionist policies eliminating competition and avoiding risk. They are as anti-free markets as known as in the classical liberal sense. It is really not about less government intervention, but a different form of government intervention, as in deregulate interests of workers and capital mobility and have the state protect corporate. So really in a true classical liberal free market, the government is not involved in the economy whatsoever. And these neoliberals want to make the claim that, hey, they're for that. And they want to get rid of all these stupid regulations, privatize everything. We can create less government that way. The issue is they're for deregulation when it benefits them. So if environmental protection regulations are cutting into their profit margin, they'll say, hey, let's deregulate environmental protection regulations. And so they're for deregulating when they have a profit to gain, but they're not for deregulating when it doesn't benefit them. So you never hear them talking about deregulating intellectual property rights because that would cut into their profit margin. Yet that would be a true free market, as in getting rid of those protectionist policies. And the issue with this form of neoliberalism is it creates a form of socialism. The worst form of socialism. It's not socialism for everyone. It's a form of socialism for the rich. Or in other words, you call them corporate welfare bums. That's what they are. Or nanny state economics is what neoliberalism actually does. So neoliberalism was an aggressive corporate offensive designed to achieve a number of corporate objectives. Business leaders sought to lower what they saw as unrealistically high or economically counterproductive living standards by reducing wage gains, inducing normal levels of unemployment, cutting state-provided social services and benefits, weakening or destroying unions, and generally dismantling the already weak popular structures that enable ordinary citizens to fight for their rights in opposition to the owners and managers of the economy. And here's a quote from Tom DeQuino. He's a member of the Canadian Council of Chief Executives, a Bilderberger member as well. We'll talk about that institution in a later episode, and ties with the Desmarais and Power Corporation. And he said, quote, "If you ask yourself, in which period since 1900 has Canada's business community had the most influence on public policy, I would say it was in the last 20 years. Look at what we stand for and look at what all the governments, all the major parties have done and what they want to do. They have adopted the agendas we've been fighting for in the past few decades." So they're telling you right there out in the open that these big business, these big corporations are influencing the policies that our government makes. Right there out of their own mouth. So let's get into how the entire economy is one massive global monopoly.
How does it work? Let's take as an example a company like PepsiCo, which is the parent company of many of the most popular soft drinks and snacks in the world. There appear to be many different competing brands, but they all come from the factories of a small number of corporations that together have a monopoly on the industry. Within the packaged food industry, there are a number of other major companies, such as Unilever, the Coca-Cola Company, Mondelez, and Nestlé. On this image, you see that virtually every well-known brand in the packaged food industry belongs to one of these corporations. You can easily get this kind of information. You can verify it on the websites of the relevant brands or on Wikipedia. Companies of this size are usually publicly traded and have a board where the largest shareholders call the shots. On websites like Yahoo Finance, we can find detailed company information, including who the largest shareholders of these companies are. Let's take PepsiCo again as an example. We see that 73.14% of the shares are held by no less than 3,379 institutional investors. These include investment companies, mutual funds, insurance companies, banks, and in some cases, governments. Let's look at who the largest institutional investors of PepsiCo are. As you can see, just 10 out of the 3,379 investors account for almost 1/3 of all shares. The combined share capital of these top 10 has a value of approximately $60 billion. But of those 10 investors, 3 own more shares than the remaining 7. Let's remember their names and let's see who owns the most shares at the Coca-Cola Company, Pepsi's big competitor. We see that just like with PepsiCo, the majority of the shares are held by institutional investors. Let's look at the top 10 and start with the last one of them. 4 out of these 6 institutional investors we also saw at the last 6 of PepsiCo. These are Norton Trust, JP Morgan Chase, Geody Capital Management, and Wellington Management. Now, let's look at the 4 largest shareholders. 3 of these we also saw in the top 4 at PepsiCo. They are BlackRock, Vanguard, and State Street. And there's another one, Berkshire Hathaway. These are the 4 largest investment companies on the planet. PepsiCo and Coca-Cola are anything but competitors. But also the other big companies that own many brands, such as Unilever, Mondelez, and Nestlé, are owned by the same small group of institutional investors. And you don't only find these names in the packaged food industry. For example, let's look up on Wikipedia what the largest companies are within the technology industry. Facebook owns WhatsApp and Instagram. Together with Twitter, they form the most popular social media platforms in the world. Alphabet is the parent company of all Google businesses, including YouTube and Gmail, but they are also the biggest sponsors and developers of Android, one of the 2 operating systems on which almost all smartphones and tablets in the world run. The other operating system is Apple's iOS. Finally, if we add Microsoft to the other 3, we see that 4 companies produce the software that almost all computers, tablets and smartphones in the world depend on. Let's see who owns the most shares of these powerful companies. If we look at Facebook, we see that more than 80% of the shares are owned by institutional investors. These are the same names we saw in the food industry. Again, the same investors at the top. Then Twitter, which with Facebook and Instagram makes up the top 3. Amazingly, we see that the company is also owned by the same investors. We see them at Apple, but also with their big competitor Microsoft. When we look at all the other companies that dominate the technology industry and build our computers, TVs, smartphones, and household appliances, we see the same big investors who own a majority of the shares. We see this within all industries around the world. And just to show you that I'm not exaggerating, I'll give you another example. Let's say we want to plan a vacation. On our computer or smartphone, we look for a cheap flight to the sun through websites like Skyscanner and Expedia, both of which belong to the same group of institutional investors. We fly with one of the many airlines, of which the majority of the shares are often owned by the same investors or by governments, like Air France-KLM. The aircraft we fly is in most cases a Boeing or an Airbus. Again, we see the same names. We look for a hotel or an apartment through Booking.com or Airbnb.com. Once we arrive at our destination, we go out for dinner, then we write a review on TripAdvisor. The same investors are at the basis of every aspect of our journey, and their power goes even much further, because even the kerosene that fuels the plane comes from one of their many oil companies and refineries. Just like the steel that the plane is made of comes from one of their many mining companies. This small club of investment companies, banks and mutual funds are also the largest shareholders in the primary industries, where raw materials come from. If we look on Wikipedia for the largest mining companies in the world, we see that their shareholders are the same institutional investors we see everywhere else. The same goes for the largest agricultural companies in the world, that our entire food industry depends on. For example, they own Bayer, the parent company of Monsanto, the world's largest seed producer, which produces 90% of all the cotton seed on Earth, as well as the majority of all other seeds. But these institutional investors are also the shareholders of the largest textile manufacturing companies in the world, and even the numerous popular clothing brands that turn the cotton into the clothes we wear are owned by the same group of investors. Whether we have the world's largest solar panel producers or the largest oil refineries, the shares are managed by the same companies. They own the tobacco companies, who produce all the popular tobacco brands in the world. But they also own all the major companies in the pharmaceutical industry and the scientific institutes that produce the drugs. They own the companies that produce our metals and raw materials, and the entire automobile, aircraft and arms industry where those metals and raw materials are processed. They own the companies that build our electronics. They own the big department stores and online marketplaces. And even the payment methods that we use to pay for their products. Because I want to keep my story as short as possible, I've decided to only show the tip of the iceberg. If you decide to investigate on your own, using the sources that you've just seen, then you will discover that even many of the most well-known insurance companies, banks, construction companies, telephone companies, restaurant chains, and cosmetic brands are owned by the same institutional investors we just saw. These institutional investors are, as I told you earlier, mainly investment companies, banks and insurance companies. They are in turn also owned by shareholders. Now, what is the most amazing thing? All of these institutional investors own each other's shares, and together they form an immense network that we can compare to a pyramid. The smaller institutional investors are owned by larger investors, who in turn belong to even larger investors. The visible top of this pyramid consists of only two companies, and we have seen their names many times by now. They are Vanguard and BlackRock. The power of these two companies is something we can barely imagine. Not only are they the largest institutional investors of every major company on Earth, they also own the other institutional investors of those companies, giving them a complete monopoly. According to a report by Bloomberg, one of the most respected institutions in the world in the field of financial data and analytics, experts expect that by 2028, both companies will collectively manage about $20 trillion in investments, and in the process will own almost everything on Earth. The same Bloomberg called BlackRock the fourth arm of government, because it is the only non-government entity that has a close relationship with the federal banks, also called the central banks. BlackRock not only lends money to the federal banks, but is also their principal advisor and the developer of the computer system that the federal banks use. Dozens of BlackRock employees had senior positions in the White House during the Bush and the Obama administrations, and currently under Joe Biden. BlackRock CEO Larry Fink is a welcome guest with many heads of state and politicians, and understandably so. He's the face of the company that pulls the strings. Yet Larry Fink does not pull the strings himself. In fact, BlackRock itself is owned by shareholders. And if we look at who those shareholders are, we come to a strange conclusion. We see that BlackRock's largest shareholder is Vanguard, and this is where it gets dark. Vanguard itself has a unique structure that makes it impossible to see who its shareholders or clients are. The elite who own Vanguard don't want anyone to know that they are the owners of the most powerful company on Earth. But of course, this is no secret to those who are willing to look into it. Reports by Oxfam and Bloomberg show that 1% of the world's population collectively owns more money than the other 99%. Indeed, Oxfam claims that as much as 82% of all the money earned in 2017 went to this 1% of people. Naturally, those who own the most powerful company on Earth would also be the richest among this 1%. In other words, they are part of the 0.001%.
So I'm going to start by just saying a lot of my experience is within advertising, marketing, and communications. I've been in communications for 20 years now. Part of that experience is with PR and being on the inside of newsworthy events. I've seen two things. Number one, news outlets lie. Make no mistake, they lie. And number two, when people don't have enough information, they tend to start to fill in those informational gaps with their own fears. I think the answers to all the questions, and I'll get into those questions, lie with one simple piece of the puzzle that I don't think anybody has, or at least nobody has talked about it yet. And that is this. Everything that you think is going on probably isn't as crazy and fantastical as you think it is. It's all about the money. And if you just follow the money, I think a lot of everything that we're going through is going to make sense. Part one, we get to the Vanguard Group. And who is the Vanguard Group? Well, the Vanguard Group is a large investment firm, and I believe they're the largest firm in the world. Now, a lot of people think that's BlackRock, but there are two reasons why I don't think that's true. Number one, all of the top companies, top 10 companies, they all seem to have this incestuous and convoluted relationship. BlackRock and Vanguard being, the top two, along with like State Street and other things like JP Morgan and Morgan Stanley, Berkshire's on there. They all seem to own one another, and it's all very confusing, and I think that's intentional. So if you go to Yahoo Finance and you type in, let's say, Apple or MasterCard, or for example, SNC-Lavalin, you're going to find that the Vanguard Group is at the top of that list. So you type in Apple into Yahoo Finance, and then you go over to the holders tab and you find out who the top shareholders are. You're going to find it's the same companies over and over again. So using Apple again as an example, you type in Apple, you go to the holders, and you find out who owns Apple. And then if you go to BlackRock, which is number one in a lot of people's minds, then you find out that they're part owned by several people as well, and their holders include the Vanguard Group. But if you go to the Vanguard group, you don't, that's where the trail goes cold. And that's because the Vanguard group has a unique situation. And that situation is all of their clients are sold part ownership in the company. So even though they're a public company, you can buy stocks, their shareholders are protected by client confidentiality. So we don't know who actually owns Vanguard Group. So from here on in, when we talk about what benefits Vanguard Group, we're really talking about mostly those select flagship clients that are 5 million and up. Okay, so that's point number one. You need to know about the Vanguard Group. Go to Yahoo Finance and start looking at any company that you want. So that brings us to why Vanguard matters. So great, they're a successful company that has their fingers in the pie of every single corporation, bank, manufacturer. If you eat it, smell it, wear it, watch it, listen to it, apply it, spend with it, travel with it, Vanguard owns a piece of it. And if you do some forensic accounting, you're going to find that even though it says they own about 6% as the top shareholder in a company, if you look a little deeper, it's really usually about 10 to 15%. And they own so many things that it's safe to say that Vanguard owns, or at least makes 10 to 15% off of most of every single sale on the entire planet. So Vanguard matters. And when I say they own controlling our major shares in most of these companies, and since the companies want to please the shareholders, they pull a lot of weight. So that's the global picture. Now, if you're not sure why that pertains to you, it starts pertaining to you when you see things like lockdowns, and you start asking the questions, why did they lock down small business and churches, but they're sharing pictures all the time of people packed to the rafters in Costco or Walmart? So why did the social distancing really not apply to Costco and Walmart? Well, that starts to make sense when you find out that Vanguard owns Costco and Walmart. So it's profit. So they're taking money away from small business and putting it towards large business. Who also made most of the money last year? Amazon, owned by Vanguard. Now it really starts to make a lot more sense as to what else is going on, and this starts to get where it's really frightening. Would you consider it collusion or racketeering, or would you have a problem with the fact that Vanguard owns Twitter and Facebook, the two biggest companies that are trying to censor alternate information against the vaccine and the lockdowns, while shaming you to anybody who doesn't want to get the vaccines or against lockdowns? You're calling it anti-vaxxers or science deniers. They're working actively at doing that. They're owned by Vanguard. But Vanguard also owns Pfizer and Moderna. So the companies telling you to get the vaccine are also owned by the same company who are selling the vaccine. So you can see where this starts to become a problem. Okay, now I know you're going, well, that's Moderna, so what? What does that have to do with governments? Wait. I'm going to Perry Mason the hell out of this thing. Okay, so that brings us to part two, which is the World Economic Forum. Why the World Economic Forum matters is going to make complete sense in a second. Most people think the World Economic Forum is pulling the strings. Well, why wouldn't you? Because there is a stereotypical Bond villain at the helm. Everybody thinks that, sure enough, they're pulling all the strings, right? But I think, just like Vanguard is underestimated, I think that the World Economic Forum is overestimated. And if you think that they're not pulling the strings, and start instead looking at them like a marketing/propaganda department for Vanguard, then you go to the partners list on the World Economic Forum, and you're going to start to see that the partners list starts looking a lot like a Vanguard Group holding statement. So these are all the companies that they own. And they're right there. When you start looking at the partners, this is why I think Vanguard's at the top, because on the client list or the partners list, you can find BlackRock, but you can't see Vanguard. Where'd they go? Why don't they want to be on the radar there? So some of the partners that are part of the World Economic Forum are Apple and MasterCard and SNC-Lavalin. And I think by now some of you know where I'm going with this. But there's another part to the World Economic Forum. Now you can go there, you can see all the companies that are on board with the World Economic Forum statement, and by extension, Vanguard statement. Okay? Some of those companies are Apple, MasterCard, SNC-Lavalin, as I mentioned. So we've now connected certain politicians to Vanguard that way. And then can we make a circular relationship? So that brings us to part 3, Vanguard Group and Government Connections. And a quick, simple search on the federal lobbying database will show that Vanguard has an active relationship lobbying our government. So now we've showed a reciprocal relationship between the two. Telling the people early in 2020 that the only way to end this pandemic is when we have a vaccine. It's important to note to this point that in the last 20 years, a successful COVID vaccine has not been achievable. How was it in early 2020? Justin Trudeau was so sure that the only way out of this pandemic was going to be through a vaccine. Reasonable science would have said that can't be our only goal because it hasn't been achievable up until now. But he was so sure at that time. By telling you that there's only one solution, that's racketeering, by definition. So he's already got the solution. He's going to force you to take that solution. That's what that is. And so here's why I think coming together works. We have a reason. We have a strategy. We have a one unified strategy. Don't buy from Vanguard. Doing a defund Vanguard campaign means that we're taking on the largest company in the entire world, and by extension those flagship clients, and we can all pretty much guess who is probably on that list.
So BlackRock and Vanguard own the global economy. And many will say we don't know who the owners are, who the shareholders are. But in order to have that level of power to create that kind of organization, somebody would have to have enormous amounts of power before even instituting BlackRock and Vanguard. So the people behind these organizations may be the same ruling class families at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. Maybe it's those people. But I'll link to these two documentaries at the end of the episode. But if you're not watching Cult of the Medics by David Whitehead, you are missing out. So, yeah, I don't know why you have Netflix when there's plenty of good information and documentaries out there for people to learn what the hell is going on. So we talked about interlocking directorates, creating a command economy, mergers and acquisitions of corporations, and how they start becoming part of these financial institutions called BlackRock and Vanguard. So we essentially have a monopoly of our economy in the hands of a few individuals. So what's the issue with monopoly? Well, it creates many problems for consumers. First, it eliminates competition. 2, it means they can price fix and raise the prices of goods and services. They have control over resources. They have control over our markets. They export our jobs overseas. Business has control over economic and the political system. And this creates a centralization of decision making and really undermines democracy. It creates when you have monopolies, this actually creates restrictions on new business fields and blocks the expansion of competitive fields and actually controls development. So, for example, everybody's like, oh, green revolution, we need to kick it to big oil. That would be already solved under a free market. Those technologies are out there, and if they were properly implemented through a free market and not squashed by big oil through the patent system, we would be living in a different world today. But yet these massive corporations get away and do with what they want. And now they're for green energy, but they're only for green energy because they're the ones controlling the solar, the wind, and the corporations implementing it. So the main issue with monopoly is it means a few individuals control all the resources of the world. And if you're controlling resources, you're controlling energy on this planet, and what on this planet or the universe that isn't energy. Everything that we create is energy. And essentially we've created a system where a few individuals get to control and dictate that. And that's a feudalist structure. So let's talk about what the true purpose of corporations are instead of the ostensible purpose. It's to create people into consumers of useless goods, destroy a free market economy, and create monopolies, destroy jobs and prosperity of the many, destroy the labor movement, shape and mold government policy outside of democracy, be psychopathic, pursue profit at the expense of others, and ultimately control all resource of the world and monopolize life on this planet as we know it. It's all about controlling energy. I'll finish off this episode with a quote from Abraham Lincoln, and he said, "Corporations have been enthroned, and an era of corruption in high places will follow, until all wealth is aggregated in a few hands and the republic destroyed. I feel at this moment more anxiety for the safety of my country than ever before, even in the midst of war." Abraham Lincoln. He understood the dangers of this.
I've been selling my soul, working all day, overtime hours for bullshit pay, so I can sit out here and waste my life away, drag back home and drown my troubles away. It's a damn shame what the world's gotten to for people like me, people like you. Wish I could just wake up and it not be true, but it is. Oh, it is, living in the new world with an whole soul. These rich men north of Richmond, Lord knows they all just wanna have total control. Wanna know what you think, wanna know what you do, and they don't think you know, but I know that you do, 'cause your dollar ain't shit, and it's taxed to no end, 'cause the rich men, know the rich men. I wish politicians would look out for miners, and not just miners on an island somewhere. Lord, we got folks in the street, ain't got nothing to eat, and the obese milking welfare. Well, God, if you're 5'3" and you're 300 pounds, taxes ought not to pay for your bags of fudge rounds. Young men are putting themselves 6 feet in the ground, 'cause all this damn country does is keep on kicking them down. Lord, it's a damn shame what the world's gotten to for people like me, people like you. Wish I could just wake up and it not be true, but it is. Oh, it is, living in the new world with an whole soul. These rich men north of Richmond, Lord knows they all just wanna have total control. Wanna know what you think, wanna know what you do, and they don't think you know, but I know that you do, 'cause your dollar ain't shit, and it's taxed to no end, 'cause the rich men, north of rich men. I've been selling my soul, working all day, overtime hours for bullshit pay.